So when I was asked to become the interim family pastor here at First Assembly Fort Myers, our church, along with my teaching responsibilities at the Florida School of Discipleship, I found there was a common stated need amongst our congregants that were parents and grandparents, and this was the question they wanted engaged: how to best guide and shape their younger family members. I began reading many books on the subject, a lot on parenting and grandparenting, and found one to be particularly powerful. The name of the book is The Vanishing American Adult by Dr. Ben Sasse, who, by the way, holds a doctorate in history from Yale University and is currently a U.S. Senator, a former president of Midland College. Sasse is also an evangelical Christian. Sasse's book seeks to diagnose how adolescence, which is a good thing in and of itself, has drifted to become a perpetual adolescence, a destructive thing. The problem has many aspects, but the part of the book that struck the deepest chord with readers, it's a bestseller by the way, is this: the challenge of developing a work ethic in our kids in an age with seemingly limitless consumption opportunities. And there's really a paucity, just too little work for them that we actually need them to do. So when Sasse gets through diagnosing the problem and he gets to his 5 general solutions for parents to implement, we know in our gut that productive work, that service of neighbor actually makes us happier. Yet in each particular instance, duty typically attracts us less than leisure. How do we then habituate ourselves and even the passion-drenched adolescent young people, young souls in our charge, to prioritize production over consumption, or work before play? A work ethic isn't inevitable. This current generation of teens and young adults have acquired now their own pocket-sized supercomputers. I don't know if you think that's good or ill. Smartphones, searching Google both for news that's meaningful and news that's trivial. In short, the last few generations have experienced more technological and social change than arguably any other in human history. When you look at this current culture and their lifespans, parents and grandparents are alarmed. Some are even scared of the behavioral changes they've observed in younger generations. This would be millennials, Gen Z, even mine, Gen X. For example, they've noticed that all the screen time seems to imbue their kids with a zombie-like passivity. They detect a significant decline in agency, the free will movement towards something, initiative, even liveliness in some instances. Fortunately, ours is a nation that continues to heed the advice of Ben Franklin that one is really never too old for self-improvement. Sure, it will require steady work, but such work can create habits, and habits eventually yield fruit. So, what are the 5 suggestions? We'll start with suggestion number 1 from Sasse's book, The Vanishing of the American Adult. Overcome peer culture and wrestle with other life stages. And another way he puts this is to resist presentism, or what the eminent Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame. That's the idea that the present moment is the most important moment. This isn't a virtue to avoid. This is so much as it's being just prudent advice, wisdom. We need to find ways to liberate our kids from the tyranny of the present. One basic way to do that is to know other people, especially older people. Another is to grapple with the reality of our bodies. Think about birth and death, the eternities, as Tozer put it. We are born and we grow, we suffer and decline. This idea that we are engaged in, or this practice of hyper-generational segregation of our time, is bizarre, unhealthy, and historically unprecedented. It takes intentionality and work to overcome age segregation. Suggestion number 2, do hard things. Engage in challenging work. A work ethic, like we said before, is not inevitable. Almost everyone interesting you meet, if you notice this, usually has a substantive and passionate answer to this question: what was the first really hard work you did as a kid? Bizarrely, our culture is now trying to protect kids from similar hard experiences, the self-esteem culture and parenting strategy. We should be running exactly in the opposite direction, according to Sasse. We should be figuring out how to help build a menu of really hard tasks to tackle. They need to know in their hearts and even in their bones that suffering is not something to be avoided all the time, but conquered. As one grows older, the great Theodore Roosevelt said, he's actually wrote this to his oldest son, the bitter and the sweet keep coming together. The only thing to do is to grin and to bear it. To flinch, as he said, to flinch as little as possible under the punishment, and to keep pegging steadily away until your luck finally turns. Let's go one step further and say that suffering in our work is actually a character-building virtue. So, no decent parent resists providing goods for their children. I mean, giving your kids more than you had or even more than beyond their needs is a noble impulse. Mothers and fathers should give their children bread, not stones. That's biblical. But a judicious encounter with stones has merit too. Insulation from toil and sweat brings different kinds of costs, not just benefits. Everyone with a gym membership knows this is true, even a necessity. The award-winning writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, in a letter to his daughter, explaining why she had, listen, quote, never been brought up soft, the jazz-age novelist stated the simple truth that nothing any good isn't hard. Many of the parents and grandparents who have approached me over the past years have been worrying that our culture has been sliding away, just at least discouraging us from having more conversations like the one between Fitzgerald and his daughter. We parents have been failing to transmit the age-old truth that scar tissue is the foundation of future character. Number 3, flee consumption. We're to resist consumption. We already know that Americans consume an exorbitant amounts of media every day, whether that's television, on the internet, tablets, smartphones. We just consume too much stuff. And yet, interestingly, people remain deeply unhappy and variously uncertain as to why. But we know why. Aristotle knew why. St. Augustine knew why. St. Paul knew why. Jesus knew why. Even atheists or agnostics like Jean-Jacques Rousseau knew why. We have a raft of contemporary social studies and psychological studies from neuroscientists as well as sociologists and psychologists, all saying more or less the same thing. It's this: consumption is not the key to happiness. Meaningful production is. In other words, meaningful work that actually serves and benefits a neighbor, thereby making a real difference in the world, contributes to this long-term happiness, the ancient view of happiness and well-being. Consumption, on the other hand, just consumes more and more and gets less and less gratifying. Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith recently startled colleagues and readers with an exhaustive and extensive study of the moral beliefs of college-aged Americans. In the study, he found to his dismay that a great many of them now admit to believing that well-being can be measured by what they own, and that they derive a lot of meaning and pleasure and what they would call deep satisfaction from shopping and buying things. The Western tradition has long shouted a warning here, Europe and its colonies, arguing that mere acquisition is a hollow pleasure. So, like many who have come before them, countless young Americans recognize this problem not just in their generation, but also in themselves. The easiest and probably the least demanding way may provide immediate pleasure, but does not provide true, deep flourishing or human happiness. Human flourishing, in Aristotle's term, is one through recognition of what you ought to be and the hard work of doing the things that are fitting for you as a human being in service to others. And then there's an ancient corollary to that idea. Listen to this. He or she dies for a lack of discipline. Because of his or her great folly, he or she is led astray. That's out of the book of Proverbs, and it's a great warning. Suggestion number 4, travel widely. This was Sasse's weakest point here, and more anecdotal, but he makes a distinction between tourism and travel. And he says, contrast clarifies. When you see other cultures, you see the goods of your culture. You can learn a lot about your own culture by experiencing other cultures. Meaningful travel isn't about, say, according to Sasse, partying at a dance club in Cancun or walking the tourist-only parts of foreign ports of call on maybe a luxury cruise liner. It is about engaging people in a culture who have assumptions about life, about economics, about the role of government that are far different from yours. Last suggestion is suggestion number 5 from Ben Sasse in his book, his bestseller. Become truly literate. Create a culture of reading, a culture of study and critical thinking. Obviously, we all know how to read, but you know how to read well. Do you know how to read critically and therefore think critically? Consider for a moment before you answer. Most of us who read on our phones or tablets do not read deeply or retain as much information as when we read physical books or papers, the dead tree versions as they're called. We skim. We know U.S. students continue to struggle with basic reading comprehension and skills. Take, for example, on the National Assessment of Education Progress, we know that literacy in general has been on an absolute decline since the 1960s. But remember this, America's founders understood literacy as a prerequisite for freedom and our form of self-government. we know how to read, and we read what matters. So those are Ben Sasse's 5 suggestions. Sasse said at the end of the day, he can make laws as a senator until he's blue in the face, but that's not going to matter unless we have a change at the familial level with how we're raising children and interacting intergenerationally.